What's up everyone, my name is Rosendo, welcome back to my channel, and we are back with another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at some of my older tracks, and actually we're going to be visiting a topic that I talked about in short form that I now want to talk about in long form. I believe I uploaded this short to YouTube Shorts, but I definitely uploaded it to TikTok, although I'm not really doing those short form videos anymore. But we're just going to be taking a look at something I talked about before that I want to talk about now, and something I've talked about actually quite a bit in my track breakdowns, especially probably in all of them. Probably Call, probably Progress, definitely those two. Exposition as well, all of them basically. But let's cut to the chase. Today we're going to be talking about the biggest mistake I made as a producer. So this is going to be more of a helpful video, more of sharing my experience, so that you, if you're an aspiring producer or if you are a producer, you can hopefully learn from this. If you're a newer producer in particular, you can hopefully learn from my mistake, because this is definitely one of the biggest mistakes I made. So we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about mixing today. So without further ado, let's hop into FL Studio. All right, we are in FL Studio, and in case you guys haven't noticed already, I have loaded up the first, if you saw my exposition breakdown, these are not the first 5 tracks of my discography, but I consider them to be the first 5 tracks of my discography. Basically, I don't count Low or the Fake ID remix, although Low technically counts it. Although then Call doesn't count. That's beside the point. The point is we're loading up the first 5 tracks after Exposition. Exposition, Express, Progress, Release, and Call. We're going to ignore Journey Beyond for a second. But today's video is all about mixing and the biggest mistake I made as a beginner producer. Now, if you're a new producer, hopefully you can learn from my mistakes so you don't make the same one. Now, I like to say that I made 2 really big mistakes as a producer. We're going to be talking about one of them. Real quick, the first one is just not releasing tracks. There was a period where I was releasing tracks just kind of on SoundCloud, and then I stopped to improve and get better. And then I picked things back up with Fake ID and with Low and with Exposition. But again, the video is not about that. But real quick, the first mistake I think I made was not releasing tracks and not having a discography related to my name. So if you're a new producer, release tracks, even if you don't think they're perfect, even if you don't think they're amazing, still release them. Still start building up a discography, a portfolio, if you will, and don't make that mistake. I do want to make a video on that one day, but we're not talking about that today. Today, we're going to be talking about the second biggest mistake that I made as a newer producer, and this is something that I see a lot of new producers make. One is not releasing tracks, which is something a lot of new producers do. But number two actually kind of goes hand in hand with number one. Number 2 is not finishing your tracks. And if you're not finishing your tracks, you're not releasing them for the most part. So they go hand in hand, but they don't have to be mutually exclusive. But they can be 2 different things, where you finish your tracks, but you don't release them. So that's why I mentioned that. But the point is today, one of the biggest mistakes I made as a newer producer was not finishing my tracks. So let's talk about why, and let's talk about why it matters. So I think all of us music producers are guilty of having a massive folder of unfinished projects on our computer. And it's pretty much how we are. We start a track and we think, maybe I'll do something with this, maybe I won't, maybe I'll finish it later. But as a newer producer, I think it's especially important to realize that even though you might not plan on releasing a track, even though I said you should, but again, we'll talk about that later, still finishing a track is way more important than just having a rough track idea and just leaving it to the side for when you do decide to release it. Because finishing your tracks in and of itself is a skill, and it's a skill that you want to be better at. Now, in that short form video, I talked about how my mixing skills were a little bit lackluster because I never really practiced finishing my tracks. And I mentioned in my exposition breakdown that Fake ID and Low were actually mixed pretty well because there weren't a lot of elements to mix. However, in exposition, when I started dealing with elements that I like super saws and a lot of layers and a lot of saws and chords and harmonies that I needed to mix, along with, big basses and big drums, I struggled quite a bit to get them to a finished quality because I lacked the skill of actually finishing tracks. But to cut to the chase, the point I'm trying to make is it takes a lot of skill and practice to take your track from 80 or 90% done, where it just sits on your computer and you think, oh, you know what, it's pretty good, it's almost there, it just needs those final things before I upload it, to all the way to something you're satisfied with uploading for distribution to all platforms. So basically what I'm getting at is, in mixing, those final finishing touches of getting your track ready for distribution are actually really hard to get right if you don't practice them. So I think it's important to actually practice finishing your track so you can get the quality right, instead of struggling to get it to sound radio ready the first time around. Now, with that being said, I'm going to talk about how this plays a role in my tracks and how you might avoid making the same mistake. All right, so here we are in FL Studio, and again, I'm going to talk about this in the context of my tracks. So the point I'm trying to make is, let's take Exposition for instance. Let's talk about Low first, because in Low and Fake ID Remix, I mentioned that there weren't a lot of things I needed to mix, and there weren't a lot of things that I needed to really get dialed in, basically super sauce was the big thing I talked about in my exposition breakdown, that I really struggled mixing all of these big wide elements because I didn't have any practice mixing them. So even though exposition and express were pretty easy to get, 90% done, where I really liked the arrangement, I liked the sounds I chose, I liked the progression, I liked everything about it, just getting them to the point where, okay, now I need to dial in the mixing, I need to make sure nothing clashes, I need to make sure everything sounds good, I need to make sure everything has its own space. I struggled quite a bit with that because I actually never practiced that. Now, this goes hand in hand with the other mistake because, a long time ago, 2018, 2019, I think 2019, actually 2019, 2020, I was releasing tracks, but they were pretty bad. They were pretty mediocre. And the mixing was just, I didn't really know what I was doing all that much, but that's beside the point. Point is, I released a few tracks and there I did practice actually, finishing tracks and trying to get the mixing to sound decent, even though it didn't. But after that point, from 2020 to 2023, I did not practice finishing my tracks. I was making a ton of tracks, but I never practiced actually finishing them with the intention of, I'm going to finish this as if I were to distribute it to streaming services, as if I were to upload it for people to hear. And that last little bit of mixing makes all the difference, because taking a track from, again, 80 to 90% done where you like how it sounds, but you just need to make those final finishing mixing touches, I'm specifically talking about mixing here, is really hard to get right if you don't have practice with it. And by the way, in all this, I should mention, I'm strictly talking about mixing here. If you have someone who mixes for you, or if you're already really good at mixing, this video doesn't really apply to you. But if you mix your own tracks, if you're still doing all the EQ, compression, reverb, maybe reverb's kind of an effect, all the EQ, compression, the side chaining, the dynamic stuff, the multiband, all that stuff. If you're doing all that stuff on your own and you're new to it and you just need some practice doing it and you don't do it all that often, this video is for you. But if you're really, really good at mixing, if you know what you're doing, or even if you know what you're doing, but you still do it on your own and you still need some practice like I do, now I know kind of what I'm doing, but I definitely still need practice with it. But in general, if you're an expert mixer, or if you have someone mixing for you, especially if you have someone who mixes your tracks for you, I know that's really popular, then this video doesn't really apply to you. You can do all the arranging and all the sound design you want, and then have someone else worry about the mixing, and then you can click away from this video if you haven't already. But the point I'm trying to make is if you mix your own tracks, if you're mastering your own tracks and things like that, and you really need to get your tracks to sound good, sound high quality before you upload them to streaming services, and that's a skill, is what I'm saying. That's a skill that you need to practice, that you shouldn't ignore, because I didn't practice it for quite a bit, and it shows in my tracks. I've talked about that in my breakdowns, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more today. So again, getting that track from 80%, 90% finished to 100% finished is hard. It takes a lot of skill, a lot of practice in the mixing sense. So the argument I'm making here, before we finally dive into these tracks, the argument I'm making here is you should practice finishing your tracks as if you had the intention to distribute them, so you can practice taking them to the highest quality possible, because that's something that can be hard to do, especially if you're working with big elements like supersaws, big basses, or things with just a lot of bass in general. All right, so in the context of my tracks, let's take a look at this, because I mentioned how my mixing goes from, let's say, bad to, well, actually express might be a little bit worse than an exposition. It's a little bit more harsh. Let's say it goes from mediocre to bad to okay to decent to solid. And then Journey Beyond is probably the best mixing I've done. So there's a very clear progression in my mixing that we're going to break down today. We're going to listen to so that you guys can listen to just a side-by-side comparison to what difference it makes when you actually practice finishing your tracks with the intention as if you were to distribute them. So let's get straight to it, because we're going to be comparing these. So exposition. Exposition is basically the first melodic bass track, we'll call it, that I practiced mixing with the intention to distribute. I didn't know how to use compression in any of these until Call. If you saw my breakdown, you know that. So lacking compression, but even just the compression doesn't make that much of a difference, because just the skill of choosing the right sounds and giving everything its own space will show you how you progress from track to track. And as a reminder, not as a reminder, if you didn't see that short form video, which you probably didn't, these tracks are all a few months apart. Exposition was in the early winter of 2023. 2024, actually. No, I made a mistake. That's not true. Low and Exposition were in 2023, and that's when I wasn't really finishing tracks. So actually it shows. More to that point, the reason I only released 2 tracks in 2023, which were Low and Exposition, I think Fake ID was also released. So it was Fake ID, Low, and Exposition. I released 3 tracks in 2023 versus 2024. I released 10, so a huge jump. The reason I only released 3 is because it took me forever to get the mixing down in Exposition, because I had no practice mixing. So it was so hard that where I'm getting with this is once I finally had practice with Exposition and released Exposition, you're only looking at a few months in between of these tracks on average 2 to 3, closer to 2 in between each track, where the mixing just takes a very big jump to from better and better, getting better and better. So exposition was late winter of 2023, express early winter 2024, spring 2024, summer, fall, and then winter again 2024. So the goal here is to compare how just a few months of practicing finishing your tracks can make a difference in sound quality. We're gonna have all the visualizers, well, not all of them, but we'll have span over here, and then over here we'll have mini meters. You guys will see mini meters over here, which has the waveform, the stereometer, if that's how you pronounce it, and the spectrogram, I believe. I can't see it, but it's on OBS, so that's why I'm not 100% sure. But we can also just zoom in and see the waveform here, because as most of us know, when things are properly mastered and compressed, things can get pretty just compressed and thick, which you can already tell the difference just visually. The drop of exposition isn't all that bad. It's pretty well compressed. Express the same way. Progress is definitely a little bit more mixed and compressed in the drop. Release even more, call even more, and then Journey Beyond actually looks kind of the cleanest and the most consistent throughout. Over here you can see they're kind of rough and inconsistent, but they get a little bit more and more consistent. Even call is a little bit inconsistent in the waveform, but the levels are all there. It's all actually not that bad. But over here you can definitely tell it's pretty rough in the waveforms in exposition and express, kind of in progress, and it gets better and better as you go through the tracks. But enough rambling, let's cut to the chase. I thought this would be a short video, but I'm never gonna make a short. One of these days I'm gonna make a short video. Let's cut to the chase. Let's actually listen to these. So here we have the beginning of exposition, and we're not gonna listen to the whole tracks. I'm probably just gonna go through the drop of each. I'm just gonna go real quick. I just need to turn this down on my headphones so I don't go deaf. But we're just going to real quick listen to the general elements of each part and look at both the waveform over here that you can see, well, the waveform over here that you can see, and span over here. We'll zoom into each track as well. And we're just going to get a general idea of what each track sounds like and looks like. So let's cut to kind of the first breakdown of exposition, which should be right here. Actually, a little earlier. So just take a listen. First of all, if it's not clear, the bass is all over the place. This is pretty rough over here, and the sounds itself and the highs are a little bit harsh. But I just want you to listen mostly instead of relying on these analyzers. That's another big thing that you new producers should be doing, is learning to trust your ears, which is something that I'm still working on to this day. But let's listen to the drop, because again, we're here to compare drops, and then we'll probably go through them pretty quickly, just comparing immediately the sound quality of each track. So already just listening to it, the bass is definitely just a little strange there. It's not the cleanest. And the supersaws themselves are not bad. This isn't horrible mixing, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And the point is not to critique each individual's track mixing, it's to compare how it changes with just a few months of actually practicing finishing your tracks. So let me do one thing real quick. All right, so I have all of these tracks so that the drops are aligned, and we're just gonna be going through real quick. We'll start by comparing kind of one by one, but in that video, the biggest ones I compare are express and progress, because here you'll notice the biggest jump, and then it gets pretty good from progress to release, and then you'll hear another big jump when I get to call, when I learn how to use compression. But let's actually compare the drops. And again, remember, the goal here is to demonstrate how just a little bit of practicing finishing your tracks can make a big difference in your mixing. Starting with exposition. Then we have express. So again, I've talked about, and actually if you saw the last video, how the express mixing is probably a little bit harsh, but it's actually, I do notice some things I like a little bit more. For example, I actually think the bass is a little bit cleaner and it cuts through a little bit better. So you'll hear that. And it just has a little bit more elements going to it. And overall, because it has a little bit more elements in the drop itself, it's not bad. It may even be a little bit better than exposition. Yeah, it just sounds a little bit more balanced. Still a little bit harsh, but a little bit more balanced, at least to my ears and on these headphones. The bass is always hard to compare, to really compare on these headphones. So I struggle a little bit there, but to my ears, it sounds a little bit better, just a little bit more balanced. Let's go over here. even here, the whole point of looking at these is you can see the bass and express is all over the place. So definitely not the cleanest bass by any means. Although the highs and mids look a little bit more clear than they do in exposition, these are still kind of dynamic and really strange all over the place. Just a little bit more balanced than express. But again, I mentioned that the biggest difference is from, one of the biggest changes is from express to progress, so let's compare those. Very big difference. Bass is still a little bit wonky, but I mean, just side by side, what, let's say it's about 2 months. It's definitely, it might be closer to 3, but it's about 2 months of work in between these two tracks. And this is what 2 months of practicing finishing your tracks can make. You can imagine that if you don't practice finishing your tracks and you start practicing finishing your tracks, your mixing can get this much better, more or less. In between your tracks, it can go from sounding something like this to something like this. Definitely more balanced, also a lot more controlled, a lot more tame in general. Let's see, what do you guys see over here? You can't really see the spectrogram all that much, but you guys see the stereometer, you guys see the waveform. Let's zoom into the waveforms as well. A little bit more clean on progress as well. And it just sounds way better. I mean, we're not even looking at the visuals, but it just sounds way better. So now that my mixing got, again, what I would call okay, decent, maybe even solid. I would say this is okay mixing. I would say it's decent mixing. We can now compare progress to release. So the interesting thing here is that release is meant to be a very euphoric, and I would even say kind of airy track. There's supposed to be a lot of air and a lot of highs to it. So we can even compare this a little bit more to something like express and maybe even exposition, which is meant to have a similar feel and similar highs. But express is definitely meant to have similar highs, and you can compare the highs from express to release and just hear how it sounds a lot cleaner, how there's more air in release, but it sounds so much cleaner. Not to mention the bass is a little bit more controlled, as you can see. I can't quite tell from the headphones, but the bass definitely sounds a little bit better. Here it's pretty full, so it might not, at least from these headphones, it might not sound that different. You can hear in exposition the bass is hard. It's hard to hear even. Versus release, definitely a lot more consistent. And it shows, you can even see it right here. But again, the biggest difference in something like express and release is just the highs. The highs are so much more controlled. Let's get the melody of release too. Let's go over here. So a little bit more dynamic, and that's when it shows that the bass could probably be more controlled if it were compressed and things like that. But still sounds better. Let's compare this to progress now. Yeah, so even just going side by side there, it's just you hear the roughness versus over here. It sounds like night and day from express to progress. It also sounds night and day from progress to release. And it's interesting because it feels like you get so much more air and so much more kind of luscious. The chords are just more luscious and release. Although it has more highs, there are more things to work on and worry about in release. And it just sounds like it has more air, even though, and it's mixed better, which is impressive because the last time I tried to do that, it was very harsh. Here, the highs are just mixed so much better. So you would think that even though progress doesn't have as much highs and it doesn't have the focus on air, it would actually be easier to mix than than release. That might not even be the case because just a little bit of practice takes you over here. And it just sounds way more clean. So again, night and day difference. Let's go through all 4 of these tracks real quick. Let's go over here. A little bit more bass, a little bit more consistent, but still harsh. Way better, has some width to it too as well. A lot more tame, especially on the highs. So big changes kind of moving up and increasing my mixing just from track to track. Now, again, the biggest difference to call is that compression then plays a role, plays a huge role. And there were still other things I need to work on when I get to call, so I'm not going to say call is perfect. But let's compare that, probably one of the better mix tracks. Let's take Release. And interestingly enough, I listened to Release in the car, I think a day or two ago, and I realized, you know what, it's actually not that bad for a track that didn't have that much compression. So the bass has held its own in the car test, although I can't quite tell too much here. So let's just compare how it compares to Call now. And then we go to Call. Oh, so the compression, I mean, you can just tell. There's also a little bit more width to it as well, especially in the drums. Granted, there's not that many drums to worry about over here in Release. Sorry about that. There's not that many drums to worry about in Release. Sorry about that. But let's go over here. So let's compare this part to, where are we in Call? Oh, good, we got vocals as well over here. But let's take a quick listen to the start, the three drops of Call. You have the start right here. You get the lead over here. So not bad, and the bass sounds more consistent. You can see it's more consistent, although it's not perfect because my compression is now better. And then you get vocals. So let's compare the two parts with vocal chops on Release and vocals on Call. Right here. Yeah, big difference. It's still not the best, but it's so different. It's definitely more control. Look at when these vocals come in. You can see that it still gets more dynamic. The highs and the mids are all over the place, and in Call, it's way more consistent, way more controlled. A lot less moving around over here. And again, the bass is just a little bit more controlled. So one more time, side to side. Again, try to listen to this. Listen for that compression change too, because I'm just talking about how it sounds, but you can definitely tell it's just a little bit more literally compressed, which I mentioned in that breakdown about how you can hear the difference. So listen for that as well. Yeah, the compression is there. Very big difference. Real quick side note, maybe I'll mention this. I want to kind of make a compression breakdown video. Real quick side note, if you're a new producer and you're struggling a little bit with stereo image, I struggled a ton with stereo imaging on these two tracks. You'd be surprised how much of a difference compression can make. Compression basically solved my stereo imaging issues because it went from kind of everything being all over the place and uncompressed, and then things falling apart in mono because it's not compressed, to hearing how things sound in mono and being able to adjust accordingly. So for fun, let's just compare these in mono real quick. Release might not be all that bad in mono. Neither will Progress, but we'll compare them. I mean, Express is rough, but let's just go through them real quick. We're starting at the drop of each. Still very rough. I mean, the lack of compression shows. I mean, it's I'm actually, see, this is why I like comparing these, because in my eyes when I made these, and I'm thinking, you know, it doesn't sound that bad in mono. The elements are kind of there, but it makes such a big difference over here. I mean, it's very clean. Let's go to the vocals as well. Again, not perfect, but huge difference, especially compared to something like this. Let's listen to Exposition as well for fun. Not as bad, actually. But more elements to work with. It gets a little bit harder to find its space in mono. But when you compress things, all of a sudden it's not that hard. And the bass definitely cuts through a ton when things are compressed in mono. And even then, the drums are a little bit cleaner. A little bit more consistent. So there you go. That's kind of what I was getting at. Now, just for fun, we're going to compare this to Journey. I never meant to compare it to Journey Beyond, but I just decided to because I do think this is one of the better mixed tracks, although it's still not the best mixing. Even then, I'm still getting better. I'm working on a track right now, and I'm trying to make sure everything sounds a lot better than it was before. I'm getting super serious on the compression, getting super serious on things like space, mono, side, panning, and especially things like reverb, which is something that I think a lot of these tracks are missing. It really depends on what element I chose, but reverb is something that I started to kind of forget about and had it in the back of my head, and something that I definitely needed to work on a little bit more. But the point is, we're going to compare it to Journey, even though Journey's not, again, not the best mix, but I think it still has very good mixing. So let's go from Call to Journey, the two kind of closest tracks. Let's start at the beginning, actually. And we'll just go side to side. Not a close comparison because one's drum and bass and one is, actually, I mean, you can tell just going back to back. One's drum and bass and one's a little bit more kind of melodic bass, future bass, call it what you want to call it. Yeah, it just sounds a little bit more balanced, actually. I'm pretty surprised at how different it sounds to my ears. Of course, the biggest difference is just in the bass cutting through, and here there's still a lot of highs, and over here it's not as much to focus on because the bass cuts through a lot better. But let's just listen to that one more time and just listen to just overall how it sounds. I don't know, Call just sounds a little, just kind of pretty rough, just a little bit less compressed than Journey, which is the biggest difference. Journey I was able to compress a lot better. Not bad. Now let's compare Journey to what would be its closest. Exposition would be pretty close. Progress might not be all that far away, so let's just compare those three. Oh yeah, Progress is definitely a lot more rough now that I'm listening to it compared to something like this. Very big difference. It also sounds like there might be some clipping in Progress too as well for some reason. Or just some distortion. Let's compare it to Release as well. Very airy track. Again, not the worst, but then you compare it immediately to something like this, and you can tell. Quick side note, one of the things about compression that I'm starting to work on is really dialing in kind of that balance between keeping the dynamics and not keeping it overly compressed. I did some pretty light compression on things like on some of the tracks in my Expression EP, and even something like Call, because you can tell Release just sounds very, very airy without compression, although the trade-off is it doesn't cut through as much. So there is a balance that you need to strike between, I mean, there's always a balance. This is not news, right? There's a balance you need to strike between dynamics and just getting it to actually sound tight and glued together. But that is one of the things that you might think, oh, well, some of the less compressed tracks actually sound better because there's more room and dynamics and air to them. And yes, that might be true, but it really does make a difference when you just strike that balance and try to find it, just trying to get it a little bit more compressed versus you can over compress something. That's definitely a thing. So you can take the life and the air out of it, but when you do strike that balance, it will improve your quality. So don't be afraid to compress things, even though it might take some of that air out of it. Like this has a ton of air in it. It should just, at the end of the day, be a favorable trade-off to take some of that kind of dynamic energy out of it and just make it cut through a little bit better. So again, Release just sounds a lot more airy, but it doesn't quite cut through in the same way. Why don't we compare them in mono? I mean, this is very, very rough on the super saws in mono. And now let's listen to Journey. The lead cuts through a lot better. Even in mono, this isn't all that clean. Let's listen to Call. Once the vocals come in, this is pretty clean. The difference is in Journey, the lead is better mixed, so it cuts through well, and it doesn't do that bad of a job in mono. Versus something like here, where the vocals aren't there yet, it still sounds very rough. Here it sounds very rough. Let's get the vocals over here. Now this actually sounds a little bit better. Still a little bit more controlled in mono on Journey Beyond though. So let's go through all of these one more time, one at a time, down, and then we'll go backwards. We'll go through them quickly. A little bit more consistent, but definitely harsh. Not bad. Pretty airy, but now just going straight there, it's too uncontrolled. A little bit more controlled. And actually, just going straight from there, the compression does give it a good kind of compressed nature. It just sounds a little bit more equal. So it does make a difference. Now let's work our way backwards. So it definitely just gets harsher and harsher. Even just going from backwards from express to exposition, even though the harshness is here on express, it just doesn't sound as it sounds a little bit less more clean than exposition. So going backwards, you can also tell. Very big difference in each track. I realized span was closed. I don't know how long that's been closed for, actually. But it's never about the visualizers. It's always about your ears. So maybe I'm glad that it was closed there, so you didn't look too much over here, but instead actually listen to each track. So to summarize, what is the point of all this? The point of all of this is finish your tracks. If you're a new producer and you're not finishing your tracks and you're just getting them 80 or 90% done, you'd be surprised how much of a difference it can make to practice getting it radio ready as if you were to submit it for distribution. It makes a big difference, that last 10%, and it's worth practicing, because if you don't practice it, you're never going to get your tracks to the good quality that you want them to sound. And I'm speaking from experience, because a lot of tracks I had, I didn't practice finishing until I started practicing finishing them, and only then did my mixing, again, we're talking strictly about mixing here, did my mixing get better and just the sound quality of all my tracks improve quite a bit just from a few months. I mean, we're talking about a year of progress from all of these tracks. So just a year of practicing finishing my tracks, just 10 tracks later. This is actually a little bit more, because these two were released were before. So let's say 12 tracks later or so, you go from something like this to something like this. So if you mix your own tracks, finish your tracks. The final mixing and the final finishing touches you need to do to get your track to sound high quality are challenging. They can be challenging, and it's important to practice them. So even if you don't plan on releasing them, practice this skill, don't ignore them, and finish your tracks. All right, and that is about it. Now, real quick, one of the things I didn't get into, but you saw in the breakdowns, is I also talked about how I ended up using more and more mixer tracks in these. So you can also imagine that as you practice finishing your tracks, you'll start to get more creative. You'll start to add the right elements. You'll start to be a little bit more complete in your tracks instead of just doing kind of a bare bones basic layout. For example, I think Low this is interesting. You'll see the breakdown of my next track. Low, the first track I released probably, and Fake ID probably have like 20 mixer tracks. And the track I'm working on right now in January has 70. And it's actually draining my CPU quite a bit, which is for the first time that's happened. So you just get better at adding more elements and really kind of getting the most out of your tracks. So that's also important. That's also why you should finish your tracks. But other than that, that is all I have for you all. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you guys have any questions. You guys can also share your biggest mistakes. If you guys also made this mistake, if you guys also noticed that when you started finishing your tracks, maybe even releasing your tracks, you found that your mixing had to get better and it did improve, and the earlier tracks you released weren't all that great. That's also why I recommend people do release their tracks, because your first tracks aren't going to be great. They're not going to be perfect. Only by actually finishing them, and in this case, releasing them, will you be able to get better. That's why I think it's important. So again, let me know what you guys thought. Let me know if you guys have any questions or comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos, and I will see you all next time.